Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming along to a Sacred Wisdom podcast. I am joined with the amazing Stephen Denman again today, and we are going to talk about the civilization of Great Tartaria. Now, there's a lot of debate whether or not this civilization actually existed. And we have done some extensive research on this, especially Stephen, looking into translations and all various books and various dates. And I'm going to hand it over to Stephen. And Stephen's just, first of all, going to tell us a little bit about what Tartaria is and this civilization. So thank you for coming along, Steve. Welcome.
Thank you, Zach. I hope you're well. Yeah, it's a fascinating subject, the civilization of Great Tartaria. So the question is, what actually was Great Tartaria? Well, it was two things. One, it was a geographic delineated landmass, which was predominantly across northern Russia. And that would include the Kola Peninsula, which is where the Murmansk Oblast is today in northwestern Russia, and obviously the Polar Ural Mountains, the northern Ural Mountains of north-central Russia, and the Yakutsk Peninsula, right the way northward from the Sea of Japan up in northeastern Russia, and obviously including Siberia, that the far Russian east. As it's known today. So it was a vast geographic extent and expanse. And at the same time as that, it was also a culturally based civilization. So Great Tartaria in terms of the Tartarian architecture, its music, the various processes they used in paving of roads and pavements, the ornate nature of their streetlights, and many other aspects of the civilization of Great Tartaria influenced how other countries developed their own infrastructure, and how eventually they would use what became religious buildings of worship or temples that later became known as chapels, churches, and cathedrals, firstly under the Roman Catholic Church and then all the other Christian denominations as well. In terms of the repurposing of those buildings from what they had originally been used for and how they had been used to culturally influence all these other societies and communities across planet Earth. So it was two things. The civilization of Great Tartaria was both a civilization based on a geographic expanse with clear delineated borders, which can be seen obviously from the huge numbers of very detailed maps that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And also it was a culturally based civilization that was the prime mover, really, in terms of influencing how other societies and communities developed culturally and, to some extent, also spiritually.
The way the mainstream explain it is very blurred. So, Steve, if you could just give us a little mainstream explanation on how they talk about Tartaria.
Well, from the perspective of what we can class as Western science and the history of Western science, we're led to believe, from the official history that's given in schools, colleges, and universities, that Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde of Mongolia, the Mongolian hordes, literally, all the Mongolian cavalry, they literally galloped across the Russian steppes. They invaded Eastern Europe, all the way to the gates of Vienna in Austria and Central Europe, down into the edge of North Africa, down into Southern Asia, into Northern India, and where places like, Persia or Iran are today, and Pakistan and Bangladesh and so forth. And so we're kind of given this impression that they were this Oriental ethnic grouping that were almost, furiously hell-bent on invading as many countries as possible to stamp their genetic, racial, and religious authority and dominion over other cultures and ethnicities. And what is interesting is the original woodcuts and ink diagrams of Genghis Khan do not show him as being Oriental. He doesn't have a round face. He's not, in any way Mongolian whatsoever. He looked very Indo-European. Many of the actual diagrams of him show him with a red beard. He's very tall. He almost looks Aryan or Nordic in his racial and ethnic appearance. So that's interesting how that was morphed over time to almost conceal perhaps the question of his ethnicity. Now, we can't confirm either way whether he was Indo-Aryan, like a white European person, or whether he was Oriental, racially.
Hmm.
But why would they even need to do that if there was any question over it in the first place? It would just be left alone as it was.
And
So
the
that,
truth
to me,
is there's something to question on this whole, very questionable on the whole history of that area and
yeah.
his history in general. So it seems to me like there seems to be an inversion of that history.
Yeah. So the Turkic tribes are classed as the inheritors, the genetic inheritors of the Mongolians' genetics, the Mongolian DNA of Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde. The idea that they literally flowed across the Russian steppes into Eastern Europe, Central Asia. And we do know from many paintings going back into ancient Persia that the Persians racially were a blue-eyed, blonde, and red-headed Aryan race of people. That's well known, well documented, but there was a lot of ethnic mixing over many centuries. Now, so therefore, we have to ask the question: is why was there all this concealment going on? Why would they need to even bother? And then the other aspect is, you've got to remember that if all these different Turkic tribes from Central Asia, where you've got countries like Kazakhstan today, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so forth, that were all part of the old Soviet Union, the USSR. Why would all these different countries have been somehow collectively together defined as Great Tartaria? When if you look at many of the maps going back to the 14th and the 15th century, if you use high resolution JPEG or PNG images of those maps, you can zoom in into great detail and get the names of hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities that no longer exist today, because you can type the names of those towns and cities on to a Google search, or you can use Yandex or Bing and so forth, and they don't come up anywhere. Some of them do. They've linguistically and phonetically slightly morphed over the centuries, and they still exist, but there are hundreds that don't. So what happened to all those hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities over thousands of square miles that made up Great Tartaria? Well, they couldn't have all just been completely destroyed. They weren't figments of the cartographer's imagination.
Well, that's what, just going from that note, talking about Marco Polo, who went along the Silk Road. Now, he was probably one of the first to mark on the maps, right? On actually state that the existence of Tartaria.
There was some earlier historians from the Roman Catholic Church that actually did travel into Central Asia and Eastern Asia, were very aware of dynastic China. But he was one of the first that really made a very long-term extensive study of the geography, the cultures and the ethnicities of the various communities and civilizations that existed. That is correct, yeah.
I think it was a book of marvels for the world, wasn't it? It was, I can't remember the exact title, but it's somewhere along them lines. A very old, very strangely illustrated as well. Some very strange, interesting beings within that book, which, just seemed to be, some fantasy somebody was talking about. But there's been many cartographers go along and talk about this and actually discuss maps. You can actually see the episode on the channel called Regal Emblems, and that goes through all the stages of maps. But Marco Polo was the first to put it on the map, and then it's, there must at least be another 15, 20 cartographers that basically marked it at least, right?
Yeah, there's many cartographers, mainly from countries like the Netherlands, also known as Holland, and which covered parts of Belgium, the Flanders area of Belgium. And then you had some that were German and Austrian. And they seemed to be, there was also quite a few very good English cartographers as well. And they seemed to be very, very expert in going over these old cartographic diagrams. And the question, again, you've got to ask is, you look at all the demarcated boundaries for all the countries of Western Europe in dozens and dozens of these maps, and they're pretty much similar to many of the countries today. So obviously, France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Germany, Austria, Spain, Portugal, etc. And there's not much difference. But then why would, if Great Tartaria was nothing but a figment of the imagination, it was just a bunch of Turkic tribes that had some sort of loose Tartarian confederation, for want of a better phrase, why would all these people keep drawing this vast landmass that you could have fitted mainland Europe into many times over, it doesn't make any sense, because that would be literally a scientific error of huge proportions. If you imagine over 300, 400, 500 years plus, all these cartographers from Europe doing these diagrams and demarcating, there's Italy, there's Greece, there's Bulgaria, and so forth. And then suddenly it comes to Great Tartaria and it didn't even exist. Can you imagine that?
It's quite incredible. Well, I mean, it was in 2013, wasn't it, where President Putin actually gave the maps back to why he felt why that happened is very significant. And I think people should listen to that. There is something happening there. And, maybe for us to uncover and rediscover. But Steve, what was it that was so special about Tartaria? Because all the old world, just so you know, guys, it can be called Tartaria or the old world. Steve, what is it with Tartaria that was so special and unique, and why was it erased?
I think I have touched on this before, but I do think it was more than one reason. The first being there was a vast usage of free energy systems, the use of telluric electricity being drawn down from the atmosphere of planet Earth into capacitors in buildings that we know today as chapels and churches and cathedrals, which were really cymatic based and chromatic or color based healing temples for the congregations, the laity, the attendees that would go into these beautiful spiritual buildings. So in terms of the healthcare, the medical assistance of the common people in Great Tartaria, you had a unique civilization where there wasn't a need for a state-funded healthcare system. So, for example, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, we have what's called the National Health Service, or the NHS. Well, they didn't need it because you didn't need pharmaceutical medication. You didn't need allopathic remedies. You didn't need any of it. People would just go into these buildings that have become the chapels, churches,
on natural rhythm, yes,
and natural rhythms, and using different colors, matching the light vortexes or the chakras in the auras of their bodies.
And can I just interject there and say that this is a science we're still understanding, so everybody's inputting into this, so nobody really knows exactly the full story of this, but we're understanding it all, aren't we, Steve?
Yeah, it's an ongoing process for all of us of learning, discovering new things. And we've got to remember that a lot of information is in the Cyrillic Russian. It's within the Russian language, hasn't been translated into what we call the lingua anglica, the English language. There's a lot of there's documents in the German language and in Spanish and so forth. So there's been a real problem getting access to fully understanding what Great Tartaria was about, and why was it seen as such a powerful civilization, and why was it also seen as such a threat? And obviously one aspect is the free energy systems. So people had optimal health there. They lived, many of the Tartarian Aryans would live easily to 250, 320 years old or more. And
can I just ask, where did that information come from? Where did you find that in translations in it?
Yeah, that information isn't readily available. There's actually blogs. For example, you have what's called Russian Hyperboreanism, and this is actually a cultural movement in the Russian Federation today. A lot of people say it's a load of quackery. It's all based on the assumption that Great Tartaria existed, and there's many people there that discuss the longevity of the lifespans of these Nordic Tartarians or Tartarian Aryan people that lived, in northern Russia. So we know that they didn't live to sort of 70, 80, 90 years old. They didn't have the diseases or the infections or viruses that were quite commonplace in parts of mainland Europe, therefore Western Europe. We know that they were able to use sound vibration, cymatic healing, combined with chromatic or color-based therapy to do with the stained glass windows in these various religious buildings, and also governmental buildings as well. It wasn't just buildings that we would define as, chapels, churches, and cathedrals. And so everybody there was living these quite idyllic lives, and their lifestyles were quite magical in that way. So we know another aspect why the civilization of Great Tartaria was so important was because of its connections back to the civilization of Scythia, and before that to Hyperborea, which is the
Yes.
civilization that had existed in the Arctic Circle, the North Polar region, and
Yep.
also across Greenland, Iceland, Spitsbergen, and the whole of northern Russia. And we know that pyramids have been found on the Kola Peninsula, and the Murmansk Oblast of northwestern Russia is just one small example
Mm.
of the remnants of Hyperborea. We know there's rumors of large pyramids up in the polar Urals and the northern Urals of north central Russia as well. But that's a really big subject to get into. But what is interesting is that we can see there was a number of really clear reasons why the civilization of Great Tartaria was not particularly well liked by certain, shall we say, perhaps secret societies, by possibly even the Roman Catholic Church,
Mm.
because they had such a dominance and influence over other cultures across planet Earth. And if you have a system where you've got free energy drawing down telluric electricity that's completely boundless from the atmosphere of planet Earth, you have people with longevity, optimal health, no need for medical assistance or state-funded healthcare and pharmaceuticals, no
It's going to
need
be
for
quite hard to control.
yeah, that's it. And
Sorry.
we know that the civilization of Great Tartaria, it's not known. There's never been any confirmation if they had a currency or a banking system or any kind of financial system. And
Mm.
it's therefore believed they did use some kind of very intricate and quite a sophisticated method of bartering
Mm.
with the various other nations around. And of course, back many centuries ago, Western China was called Cathay. The actual region of Western China was Cathay. It was also known as Oriental Tartaria. So that's interesting in itself. So it was almost like there was a cultural transposition going on there between Western China into southern, Tartaria, which is quite interesting in itself. So there was a fusion, or cultural fusion, if you like, taking place many centuries ago. So we know they had a lot of influence over other societies, ethnic groups,
That's
and
just something
religious
I'd like
groups.
to talk about, is because people have this impression when we talk about the Tartarian Empire and these buildings that they were everywhere around the world and they occupied every country. But the point is their civilization was in that kind of area of northern Russia, that area. But it's their influence of this free energy systems that went around the world and does help design these ornate buildings and structures that we can see all over the place, and would have been virtually impossible at that time to build.
So if you take a look at the United States of America as one example. So, we've discussed the first mud flood, the second mud flood, the third mud flood. Now, if you've got
We'll come on
roads,
to the mud floods, just to say, people, we're going to talk about the mud floods, but Steve, sorry, carry on.
so if you've got a situation where you've got mass inundation of billions of cubic tons of water, torrents of it pouring over roads, access roads to these large buildings, what would happen? All of that would be silted up under many feet of silt and gravel or soil and clay that would then set hard in the sunshine and be buried. And that is the reason why in so many of these black and white photographs from many of the cities in the United States of America, you go to the eastern United States is one example.
They're completely empty.
Yeah, but you can see where they've been excavating out.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
you can
certainly.
see how far down, 15, 20, even maybe up to 30 feet below ground. And you can see full-sized sash windows with wonderful fenestration. These are beautiful windows and doors with very intricate fenestration, gorgeous recessed stone masonry designs. And they're just buried. Well, you wouldn't put all that into, just bury it. Nobody would do that. It doesn't make any logical sense for any architect or construction company to do that. Again, it's because the history is being edited, though those periods of time have been edited completely to deliberately conceal what the true history of our past is on planet Earth. And if the truth came out about Great Tartaria, which we can call the old world or the old world empire, or even the old world order, then you have to start questioning other concepts and ideas, such as the hollow earth, the idea of unidentified flying objects or UFOs, extraterrestrials, and many other subjects that are classed as taboo or unorthodox, that aren't accepted by Western science. And then the very concept from questioning the our version of history, where Great Tartaria has been deliberately suppressed and deleted and censored, is you come on to the validity of Western science itself. What is Western science? Is it is it there to actually create, new discoveries? Partly, but is it also there to shape human consciousness, to keep it funneling people's perceptions of this 3D holographic reality in a certain direction, so they're not focused on the wider picture?
Certainly.
And that is, everything is multidimensional, everything is frequency, vibration, and energy, and not everything's within the visible light spectrum. And in Great Tartaria, most of the people, this was readily known and accepted because obviously the types of healing they used. So they were aware that which was invisible in terms of cymatic sound-based healing was beneficial to
Can
their
you
physical
explain to the audience as well the information? Because a lot of people ask where this information comes from, and just in general, because I know you look at, well, I do as well, look at other search engines and do that, but you've done a lot of translations. People need to understand that this is in, I know we said it before earlier on, but just this is in the words, the way it's translated in books. And obviously the English language, we're given one version, and in different countries and different languages are given others. And people, and really people, if people know other languages, they're usually quite intelligent. So they know the common person won't look into this. They know
most people are not going to spend time going to like any blogs or forums, and there are thousands of them if you look on Google or Yandex. I mean, Yandex, as you know, is a search engine from the Russian Federation anyway. So
interesting.
People aren't going to then
very different.
It's quite arduous to cut and paste hundreds of pages from Russian blogs and forums to do with Russian Hyperboreanism, mentioning Tartaria and the past, and and the fact there was healing going on. And we know even today, when you take a look at, for example, chapels, churches, cathedrals, you have choirs, so they're still using human vocals
and bell ringing as well.
Yeah,
bell ringing. I mean, that's a very strong
and the
harmonic.
The organs as well. So there's still, and so you have the bells. So this is sending out, specific types of sound waves in specific keys that are drawing the congregation or the masses to come into that chapel or church or cathedral and to praise, Yeshua ben Yosef, the Lord Jesus Christ, the archangels and all of the angels in the heavenly kingdom, and ultimately the Lord God Almighty itself. So that was Christianity in that way is very comparable actually to the various religious practices of the Tartarians, who were very focused on the Christ consciousness, which I think is another reason why the civilization of Great Tartaria in northern Russia and its cultural influences around planet Earth is so important, because it gave human beings something to sincerely aspire to, apart from the mundaneness that most people have. And if you've got boundless free energy systems of telluric electricity, you can draw down for, heating and lighting in autumn and winter, and then you can use it actually to create ventilation and cooling in the spring and summer. It kind of lessens the stress on people. If there's not even a rudimentary financial system, and I'm just theorizing here, we have no way at the moment of confirming either way whether there was a currency or not in Great Tartaria. But we know that bartering was commonplace. We know that bartering was commonplace amongst the Golden Horde of Mongolia, and it was still commonplace for many of the Turkic tribes in different parts of Russia today.
What I'm particularly interested in is how these energy systems work. Now, I've been looking into it a lot, and I can understand the concept of mercury, liquid mercury spinning. And you'd obviously, these would be up high and picking up the electromagnetic energy within the atmosphere. So the higher you go, there is actually an energy currents inside our atmosphere, which we're not really told about. And these balls would spin with the mercury, which would send down the energy into the building, right? And it's very interesting that mercury was banned. It's become illegal, isn't it? It's very serious. If mercury poisoning and all this stuff that went on in the 80s, right?
Absolutely. So there was a deliberate process, and the indoctrination was put into schools, colleges, and universities that mercury the vapors of mercury even touching this liquid metal. I mean, mercury is a fascinating liquid metal when you see it up close. That it was toxic, it was damaging to physical health. But you could say that to a lesser or greater extent about many different things. We have to remember that
exactly, just go in a supermarket.
Exactly, yeah, absolutely. So if we take a look at, for example, of the Vimana, which mean in the Sanskrit language means traversers of ancient Vedic India, they use what were known as mercury vortex engines. Now, there are many documents that have shown this, the diagrams, the schematics showing the actual specific intricate details of these mercury vortex engines, because they were used for anti-gravity propulsion. The same thing happened with in National Socialist Germany with the Third Reich. So we have, that the so-called breakaway civilization of the Fourth Reich was using mercury or quicksilver turbine engines, I think, for want of a better phrase, for anti-gravity purposes. Now, there are many experiments that have been done with mercury or quicksilver where you can create it in terms of a centrifuge. You can create it moving at a certain speed, a certain rate of speed. And the faster it goes, it will create, because of the molecular structure of mercury or quicksilver, it will create a certain type of torsion field that creates a lift that therefore can repel or deflect gravity, there, i.e., creating levitation.
Very interesting.
Now, we know that in Great Tartaria, there's always been that rumor that the Vimana or traversers of, shall we say, India, they weren't just in India. They would probably have different names in terms of, they were types of maybe airships, or, we would call them today anti-gravity spacecraft, perhaps. But they possibly did exist across Great Tartaria and northern Russia. And, if they existed, in Vedic India thousands of years ago, what's to say that there wasn't, anti-gravity spacecraft or airships of some kind or not? I don't know. That may have existed in the civilization of Hyperborea. So
I think it's very, very possible. Again, we can't verify it all for sure, but it does make a lot of sense. And, look at where the military are today, the American military, and what they're making and creating, and all the technology, hidden technology that's out there that's just not publicly known.
Yeah.
But Steve, obviously there was a destruction of Tartaria, and the way it's put across on TikTok and all these different social platforms and people just coming into the subject, they explain it like a conspiracy, and suddenly this mud flood just wiped out everything. And then it wasn't there. I know this is just the stupidity of it. And then, it makes it sound stupid. But Steve, I know you've researched this tremendously, and a lot of people have asked me about this, in the sense, where did those dates come from, and how did you get to the dates of the mud floods? And there was 3 mud floods, wasn't there? And I agree with you, the dates, but you've been specific in the sense of dates. And tell us more about that, please.
So, okay, the first mud flood that reached its pinnacle, it reached the zenith, if you like, its most destructive phase, was on the 8th of January 1740. So from the very outset with the first mud flood, what I have done is actually estimated the averaging by taking, for example, the fact that the previous winter with the first mud flood of 1739 to 1740, resulting in the Great Frost of 1740, which is seen in hundreds of paintings in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, with the frost fairs on the frozen River Thames, frozen for up to 5 months of the year in central London and across elsewhere in the United Kingdom, including...
Was that a mini ice age at that time?
Yes, it would have been classed as a mini ice age, a global cooling cycle leading to a mini ice age of a few hundred years. So again, with the mini ice age, you don't get an onset suddenly. It's warm one summer, then suddenly the next year it's plummeting sub-zero temperatures. It's a gradual process over many years. So when it comes to the Great Frost of 1740, that just didn't happen overnight. There was many years prior to 1739 of massive problems with rainstorms and hailstorms and gale force winds, turbulent weather that led up to that process. And then what we see is the Great Thaw started, and that happened as of literally January of 1740.
Right. Okay. Wow.
So I've taken that a date of the 8th of January 1740. It's literally into the second week of January, because from the research that I've done, there was so much calamitous
Yep.
weather conditions at that point, and multiple smaller flooding going on across mainland Europe in places like France and Germany and Belgium and Holland and Denmark and so forth. So that's why I did it. So it was an averaging of all these other historical dates, and
Yep.
I came to that. That's not saying that that event took place, as with the second mud flood
Yeah.
and the
Sure.
third
I
mud
get.
flood,
No, I
just on
understand.
that
It's the
specific
pinnacle. Yeah,
date.
for sure. Yeah.
I am reiterating, because I think I have explained it before. It's not saying, yeah, it happened. Obviously, for example, if you take a historical event like the beginning of World War II, that's different. That was the 1st of September 1939, and it
Sure.
ended in Europe on the 8th of May 1945. But that was a geopolitical based event.
And that's very different. Yeah.
Weather's not the same as the atmospheric conditions and cosmic radiation and solar cycles. The sun doesn't just go into a dormant phase of no coronal mass ejections within a 24, 48, or 72-hour period. It takes, so this is the same process and approach scientifically that I used for the dates for the second mud flood and the third mud flood. The Great Frost of 1814 came off the back of the winter of 1813 to 1814.
Yeah.
Now, if you go back, and you need to do, I'm not going to do the research for other people. If you go and look at the weather records between 1814 to 1834, there was around a 20-year build-up
Yeah.
of increasing problems with bad harvests across the Northern Hemisphere, obviously in the United Kingdom and in Europe. And there was constant problems with rainfall and very cold winters, sub-zero temperatures, causing problems in springtime when planting was coming for the farmers. So they weren't able to they weren't able to dig up the ground to plant the seeds for fruits and vegetables and cereal crops.
Yeah.
So this then led up to the Great Frost of 1814, and then the second mud flood occurred later on in that year, after the winter period had come to an end. It was around by March, April of 1834. I think that's cleared that up. So, and you've got to remember, at the same time in 1834, this was the official year for the Great Reset of the elites and their secret societies.
Right.
So they were well aware of the devastation and the upheaval and the damage to infrastructure and agricultural processes and farming and transportation that had gone on. And it was used as the perfect opportunity. And obviously the second mud flood was literally ensuring that the civilization of Great Tartaria would come to an end.
So obviously we had all the migration at that point as well. So you had all the migration from northern Russia all down Eastern Europe, into Europe, and then across into the States as well, where America was kind of created. It was kind of reset and created at that time in some way. It's a very, very bizarre, strange, surreal period of history. And then
it is. I mean, the contemporary version of the United States of America is a nation built on consistent immigration.
Yeah.
Wave after wave. You've got to remember that well over 70 million Europeans actually eventually traveled into the United States, set up homes there, businesses, and became employed there. And America became this incredibly economically productive and industrious nation. It was quite incredible what had happened, considering the history of the United States of America, with the remnants of the Tartarian architecture and the buildings there, how the various Native American tribes had lived, and living alongside obviously the white giants that had existed on the North American continent. The year of 1834 is also very, very interesting, because on the 16th of October 1834, the Houses of Parliament, also known as the Palace of Westminster, were completely destroyed by fire in central London.
Very
so
interesting.
Again, if you go and look at all the old paintings of the Palace of Westminster before the 16th of October 1834, it was clearly a building that had been constructed, at the very least, with strong influences from Tartarian architecture. It was an incredibly beautiful building. So they building today, Big Ben, And it's a very beautiful building, the Houses of Parliament at Westminster today, but it's
Yeah.
very different looking than the original.
Tartaria was actually mentioned in Greek mythology. I know we've talked about this a lot, but in the sense of Tartarus, wasn't it?
The official version of the story of Tartarus, it was seen as the boundless depths far into the hollow earth, full of caverns and passageways.
Mm.
And archetypally, it represents hell or Gehenna or Sheol. It represents, the infernal regions, if you like, deep into the subterranean reaches of planet Earth, where the Titans were sent by the 12 Olympians under Zeus Olympos from Mount Olympus. So they were cast into the subterranean nether regions far from the surface of planet Earth, while they ruled with their advanced occult technology as the supermen and superwomen of planet Earth in terms of Greek mythology.
So tell us about that, Steve. What is Tartaria? What is that connection to giants? Because that would be another reason why so much history has been suppressed about the giants, because there certainly has been giants on planet Earth. So, again, that would open up another can of worms.
Okay, so if you look at Greek mythology, you had,
Yeah.
the Titanomachia. So this was the war of the Vengers, or the war of the vengeful beings, which is what the word Titan means in terms of its etymology. These were massive humanoids, much larger than the average stature of giants, whether they were 12 feet, 14, 16, 18 feet tall. Some of the Titans were seen as to be 250, 350, 450 plus feet in height. I mean, just vast humanoids, but they're more archetypal than really in many ways than giants. The giants came later, and in Greek mythology, you have what was known as the Gigantomachia, the War of the Giants.
Yeah.
Now, in Greek mythology, it was the Titans, so the progenitors of the giants, were cast into the subterranean regions, the regions of the dust, the twilight zone, if you like, below the surface of planet Earth. That was the vast indeterminate depths that was so vast that no sunlight could ever reach down that far into these passageways and caverns below the surface of planet Earth. So the giants are really the children, they're the infants of the Titans in terms of we looking at, Greek mythology. Now, one of the racial characteristics that seems to always arise about so many of the giants is they had pale white complexions. Some of them were slightly ashen in their complexions, and they had bright red hair and bright red beards. Now, what the reasons for having that kind of DNA and genetics is, I don't know. But I find that very interesting as a correlation in terms of reports, and in terms of data aggregation into sort of the folklore, world folklore of giants. Why is that always being brought up? We hear of the red-headed and the red-bearded white giants in Central Asia, where Iran is, Turkey, Afghanistan. There's been sightings in the past in.
Can you just explain to people as well, because there's another question that's come up to me just as you're talking, and when you mentioned about Aryans, just explain that a little bit to people, because some people very debate that, and they're like, they have a very opinionated about what Aryans were. But obviously, let's talk about that a bit.
I think the problem arises there because of what happened in National Socialist Germany with the fixation on the Aryan Superman, the idea of the blue-eyed blonde Aryan race. Now, that was the racialization of, we can, for want of a better phrase, Aryanism. But in the ancient past, it represented those who were the carriers of higher knowledge. It was partly to do with race and ethnicity. Much more emphasis was placed on your spiritual development and the level of spiritual and intuitive abilities and potency that an individual had in terms, and because the word Aryan, comes from the word Ayas, which is a Sanskrit word. It means noble. It means pious, noble. So it wasn't really anything to do with people with blue eyes and blonde hair, or green eyes and red hair with pale
again,
white.
another inversion.
Another distortion. But then again, that's the same if you take a look, for example, at the Third Reich of National Socialist Germany was the inversion of the swastika or the svastika.
Yeah.
And in it, again, it comes from the word svastika, which is a Sanskrit word, which means being fortunate or being helpful. So the National Socialist Germans, they actually reversed the actual direction of the swastika, creating a complete vibrational distortion. Why they did that, I have no idea. But again, the swastika is an extremely ancient symbol. It's actually a symbol of the Phoenician Aryans.
Very
And it's
interesting.
actually connected also to the Irish Celtic tribes. And it was never intended for that purpose. And obviously the swastika is seen across Nepal and Tibet and other parts of the Asian continent, as well as obviously northern Russia. It's very well known. You can see it carved as a petroglyphic image into many of the temples. So
you have Tartarian, which is Aryan meaning person of knowledge, and then you have the owl flag, of course, and you have all this connection as well.
Absolutely.
So, it's very interesting. That makes a lot of sense.
Well, they look at the two flags. So the actual royal flag or regal flag of Great Tartaria was the griffin. And the flag of the common people, the Tartarian Aryans, or
of course, yeah,
and the various other ethnic groups connected to the civilization of Great Tartaria, was the owl. So look at Greek mythology again. Look at the symbolism. What were the griffins in the Riphaean mountains of Greek mythology? They were the guardians of the golden treasure that was in the luminous caverns in what is now known as the polar Ural Mountains and the northern Ural Mountains in north central Russia. That's where it's believed the Riphaean mountains are today. They're called the Ural Mountains. But so there's that aspect. So the royalty were the keepers of the wealth, the prosperity of the nation of Great Tartaria. And the people themselves were tasked with being the preservers and keepers of this beautiful spiritual knowledge, including the cymatic-based healing occult technology of their various temples, and also the use of chromatic or color therapy, and using the tuning forks in these chapels, churches, cathedrals to align correctly and cleanse their light wheels or light vortexes, also known as chakras, in their auras. Really quite profound, all of this, when you start researching. It really is.
It does, and it really gives us an insight to way we can live in this world. And I think that's the special thing about Tartaria, and actually understanding what Tartaria was, or the old world, because we can know, once we know it exists, we can actually create it. And I do feel that we will get back to this place. We will get to a place one day, hopefully, I hope in our lifetime. But whatever, this is the journey we're on. And but energy is free and energy is everywhere. And this is what we get taught, that it's only conducted through wires, but it is actually in the atmosphere all around us. Steve, just a little bit on telluric energy. Talk a little bit about that and geomagnetics. I know we've spoken about the ley lines. We've actually done the St. Mary's, which was great. And Stephen is doing a lot more episodes. We're going to be doing a bit in London very soon. So talk about that and the telluric energy and how that's working. Also maybe talking about how the Druids were back in ancient times in England, and how these ley lines were created, what was actually happening. That might be a big going off topic a bit, but just a little bit about how this telluric energy works.
Okay, so if we're looking back that far, so there's known to be a lot of connections again in Greek mythology between the Hyperborea and the Druids. They're not direct links, but there's inferments made between both. Now we know the Druids, say for example, just here in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, known at the time when the Druids were around with the Celtic Britons as Albion. That was the name Britain was given. Yeah. So you take, for example, look at the rollright stones in Oxfordshire. You can take a look at Avebury Circle. You can take a look at Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, in southwest England, and you can clearly see around these areas the land has been furrowed. The ground has been furrowed out. You look at, for example, Silbury Hill, that was furrowed around. So again, it was a way of channeling the geomagnetic energies coming off these ley lines, and actually creating literally an ecologically based capacitor process. Basically, they weren't using constructed machines or the capacitors, for example, that were used in Great Tartaria. So we know that the earth lights would emerge around many of the standing stones that the Druids had constructed with the Celtic Britons here in the United Kingdom, and that energy was used for healing purposes. We know that the Druids had a very clear knowledge of the astral plane. We know that they had a method where they were able to access the astral plane by using earth lights and the geomagnetic ley lines. So obviously they built these standing stones, such as the rollright stones in Oxfordshire and the others, specifically on usually a convergence of between two or more geomagnetic ley lines that would create a vortices, where they were then able to open that Pacific area and enter in. And it's the same reason why certain Druid groves and Druid shrines were constructed in a cleared area, in woodland or a forested expanse, because there were Pacific geomagnetic ley lines running through those areas. The telluric electricity was drawn down from the atmosphere directly above the towns and cities of Great Tartaria in northern Russia. Yeah. And the capacitors, with the mercury quicksilver, were used to create a Pacific transmission of that electrical energy that had been drawn down. It was a dispersal mechanism, so the electricity could be a bit like you have today with substations coming off the main grid. Okay. Yeah. It's a scaling down process. I mean, you've got to imagine, if you're absorbing literally billions and billions of gigavolts of telluric electricity from the atmosphere, you've got to be able to control that in the right way. It's got to be measured. Very dangerous, yeah. It is, so that it had to be channeled off, siphoned off using these capacitors, and it was transmitted out to smaller electrical devices. Again, we haven't got any diagrams to show how they would have functioned in terms of that type of a
but that just saying on that point, what I've noticed, obviously I do a lot of camera work, and what I've noticed is you'll find a central dome in one location. Let's just take London, for example, South Kensington, around that area. You'll find one central dome, a very prominent building, and it will be, then you'll find lots of little domes and aerials all dotted around. And what I believe is that energy would have been somehow conducted into these buildings. So, and it's the same on houses, some old houses as well.
But there's old woodcuts that go back 150, 180 odd years, where of travelers and just general individuals that were so fascinated by some of the towns and cities of Great Tartaria. They did these black and white pictures of what, you can see the ornate Tartarian architecture with these turrets and spires everywhere, beautiful, or stone masonry, beautiful ornamentation, the fenestration in the window styles and the doors is incredible, great archways. But up on the roof areas, you can see between the spires and the turrets what look like on some of them these antennae, and there's literally bolts of electricity flowing between these various spires. There would have been literally a glowing, visible electrical grid above a lot of these towns and cities that would have created a lot of luminescence in the nighttime. Yeah. It'd have been quite incredible to see. And there was so much of this telluric electricity being absorbed into all these different buildings, not just the chapels, churches, and cathedrals of Great Tartaria, but governmental buildings and also just people's residencies, homes. Yeah. And literally, the sky would be a cascade of electrical energy dancing and floating around in the airspace. It would have been quite incredible, very different than the urban landscapes that we're used to today with the orange or white street lights. When the clouds come over in the nighttime, you get that weird dull orange glow.
Well, I think a lot of people will notice that on old buildings that you'll actually find a grounding wire, and this will actually ground the energy, some of the old churches. So there may very well be some sort of current already going through the building, and these are actually wires. I've actually seen it on some old buildings around London, and it's very bizarre.
And then when you take a look at what happened later on, so, you had World War One, then you had World War Two, you had the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and all these different wars that took place geopolitically. They'd been designed to destroy vast amounts of the Tartarian architecture, to wipe clear and conceal as much as possible the once incredible existence of Great Tartaria as a civilization, because everything had to be done to obliterate, delete, and censor that fact from history. So and we have here today the so-called accepted consensus version of history and Western science, and everything else is classed as just a conspiracy theory. People are all a bunch of loonies. They don't know what they're talking about, and it's scoffed at, or it's just simply sidelined and completely ignored by academics altogether.
What I believe it's more to do with is actual people's laziness, and it's actually getting people want something supplied to them on a plate and everything given to them. And it's very sad that, because actually when people look into anything with any part of history and actually look beyond, slightly beyond the official story, you'll start questioning a lot more. And it does surprise me the way people that say they're intelligent and they seem intelligent don't do this. Or they're not wise. That's the difference. Intelligence and wisdom is a very different thing. Steve-O, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? It's such a vast subject. We could go on forever on this, but so moving on with Tartaria now, what we're seeing around us in today's world, we started this Tartarian architecture series, and it's because what I find is it's always repurposed to something usually quite mundane. And I think these buildings or centers are very special and have a quality, something that we can reignite in ourselves.
When it comes to the architecture of, say, chapels, churches, and cathedrals, if you take a look, a lot of the religious buildings now have roofs made with lead flashing. And I believe that a lot of these were repurposed with lead flashing. Some of them may have had lead slate tiling, but it's also my belief that many of them would have had roofs that were made of copper, or it may have been an alloy that was much better at controlling the flow and transmission of the telluric electricity down into the capacitors inside these chapels, churches, and cathedrals. And obviously not just across Great Tartaria itself in northern Russia, but also in many other countries, including the United States of America, and also in parts of Latin America as well. Which is very rarely talked about. There was a lot of cultural influences from Tartaria in Latin America that are and countries like Mexico, Guatemala, and even down into places like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile.
Steve, one of the most amazing world fairs, and it's actually on YouTube, is Rio de Janeiro. It is absolutely unbelievable, the buildings there. And I was blown away actually to see. But there's so many of these buildings and the world fairs. So obviously this came onto the world fairs, and it would seem the great exhibition. And before, I think the earliest world fair was sort of 1800s, early 1800s, I think in Paris. And they actually seem to repurpose or sell this architecture at these world fairs, or took some of these buildings apart and rebuilt them, sent them all around the world. The statues, the metals, these precious metals were, stolen. I don't know. You say a little. So Steve, talk a little bit about the connection about the world fairs and Tartaria.
Okay, well, the world fairs came in two stages. The original world fairs, if you look back at the world's expositions or world fairs, if you look at what was being exhibited or shown there, a lot of it was quite mystical and quite unique, but it wasn't always based on mechanisms or machinery or the idea of an industrialization of the Western world. So it was more to do with magical thinking. It was about harking back to the past, the epics of what almost looked like, Greco-Roman cities, for example, and really quite beautiful, even connotations connected to the civilization of Atlantis, as well as obviously the civilization of Great Tartaria in northern Russia. So then later on, you see this transition taking place of mechanization, industrialization, introducing the greater stages of the Industrial Revolution, the removal of this magical and spiritual aspect of the world fairs, it becoming very mechanistic, very egocentric, very materialistic in its basis and function. So what I believe was going on with the world fairs, it was taking the different populations and different countries on planet Earth, along this conduit of introducing the more magical, the more mystical, the more spiritual aspects of the past, connected to the civilization of Great Tartaria and its remnants in the Tartarian architecture that was constituted, and it was repurposed and integrated into those early world fairs. But a lot of it was then completely demolished in the later world fairs, and it was all about machinery and productivity and factories and getting people thinking in a certain way, and maritime based scientific endeavor and all this stuff, and changes to healthcare with infants and the elderly, and the architecture also started to change. You see a huge change. So, for example, if you look at the Eiffel Tower in Paris, which is next to the River Seine, it's believed that there were huge electrical capacitors built around the four legs of that huge structure, and it was actually a massive antennae that was absorbing telluric electricity from the atmosphere above the city of Paris. All those capacitors were then literally decommissioned, completely dismantled, removed and ripped out completely. All the connections and wiring there were removed. It was just seen as an ornamental Eiffel Tower, a wonderful quaint Eiffel Tower. You can get the elevator.
It goes up and down in a lift, go up and down. That's it. Someone just built it to put a lift in it for sightseeing, right?
So you have an outdoor museum piece, basically. That's what it becomes, a relic from the past.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And then people just learn to accept within a 20, 30-year period, each generation accepts.
Yes, that's right.
The Industrial Revolution is the way forward. And that's why you have these horrific photographs and paintings of pre-adolescent children, thousands of which not even wearing any health and safety equipment. They're not wearing any footwear, and most of them weren't being paid.
Yeah.
And there wasn't obviously any parental control. They seemed to be controlled by the factory owners.
A lot of orphans at that time. Very strange, very surreal.
Yeah.
I don't think people realize the mark of 1851, the Great Exhibition. That was a very symbolic age, and people, that almost like a wave of brainwashing came about, and it was the reset there. There was a reset of nature. And something happened in people, and people's attitudes, people's communities were broken. A lot of this happened. It's very disturbing time once you look at it. I advise everybody watching this to look at old photographs of the 1800s, look at information on the 1800s, and understand where we are today is because of this time, this transition. We have been brought to this time because we have lost this knowledge. And I do believe Tartaria is knowledge that can reactivate this information and will get us very excited about this world we're in, because this world is fascinating. This world is amazing. Don't let anybody ever tell us that it's not, So me and Stephen, our aim is to bring more magic to everybody and bring this information in an enlightening way and positive information that will transform you and help you build yourself as a person and build your own energy to be the best version of who you are. And you can also purchase our book Mysterious Realities, and there's a chapter in there on Tartaria, but we will be going into a lot more detail about Tartaria, and Stephen has written out some excellent episodes to come, so please subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you very much, Stephen Denman. As always, you're absolutely amazing. Thank you for your amazing knowledge, and it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.